around. If we wanted to maybe make an animation of these falling down in a certain way, you can see there's still only 4 of those objects, 1 of each kind, and they're inside this cloner. So the cloner is creating all of this. So, but there are ways that we can manipulate the clones and have them do certain things. So transform in certain ways, move into position, rotate, scale up and down, things like that. Let's take a look at a simple way to do that. Now, if we go ahead and select the cloner, you can see at the end of this, there is a section for effectors, and right now it's empty. So this is where we would want to put any effectors that we want to have affect this. So we're going to start by just creating an effector. We're going to go to MoGraph effector, and let's create just a plain effector. So basic effector. Now we want to have this effector fall off because we're going to be moving this around, and so it kind of tells Cinema 4D that we want to only use the effector within a certain bounds. So we'll change the shape from infinite, and let's create a box. So we can increase the size of the box, and I want to make the size kind of roughly the size of our kind of grid here. And so I'll just use the handles, and you can see that's changing the size of the effector. You can see there's an area of fall off within this kind of red area where we can kind of increase that. So I want to make it something like this initially. Now we kind of want to decide what we want to do within this effector. So let's make sure that it's assigned to the cloner. We'll grab the effector and just drag it into the cloner. And then we'll select the plane effector and we'll go into parameter. And these are the parameters that are going to change here. Right now it's set to 100 centimeters. So it's moving it 100 centimeters in the Y direction. And you can see I can sort of increase that, set it up to 1,000. And now you can see as I move this effector, it's actually moving those up. And then as it flows through it, it's moving them back down. Okay, so let's increase this size a little bit more. So it kind of completely encompasses this. Make it a bit thicker as well. Maybe. I grab the line there. There we go. So kind of put it completely inside of here. And let's set this value a little bit higher. So maybe about, let's see what that value is, about 50,000. And that's maybe a little bit too much, so let's make that 20,000. So now you can see as I move out of that range, they're moving back down into position. As that covers them, they're moving 20,000 centimeters in the Y. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. We're taking the plane effector, and so the effect is happening within this box. The effect is we're moving up this many units. As that effector leaves where the objects are, you can see it falls off within that area of fall off. Those objects are moving back down into their original position. Okay, now you can see because this is a straight line across the bottom, they're moving in completely straight lines. So what happens if we want to randomize this a little bit? Let's go ahead and add another effector. So we can take our cloner, and if we have our cloner selected and we add our effector, it should automatically get added into this box. We shouldn't have to drag it in. So let's grab a random effector. So now we have the plane effector and the random effector. We'll go into the random effector, and this is going to randomize different elements of the position, the scale, the rotation. So let's assume that we want them all to still be the same size, so we won't touch the scale, and let's assume that we want the rotation to remain the same. We can come in here now and randomize just the position. So right now it's kind of a range here, 50 centimeters in the X, Y, and Z. So we're getting some randomization front to back. You can see that. Let's say we don't want that. We can zero that Z out, and they'll all stay lined up. But if we want to randomize the position of the X a little bit more, we could do that. But the main thing that I want to randomize is the up and down position. And so we can come in here and randomize that so that the position along each row is sort of up and down. Let's go to the fall off and let's create another box fall off. Okay, I'm going to turn off the plane effector for now, and I want to make the random effector fall off about the same as the plane effector. So I'll go ahead and drag this up until it kind of encompasses the grid there, just like we did with the random, or the plane effector rather. Kind of bring that out. Let's take our fall off out a little bit. Okay, so something like that. And you can see if I move this out, they sort of straighten up, and if I move it back down, they randomize themselves a little bit more. Now I want this to move with our plane effectors. So let's select both of them and let's group them. So right click, group objects. And now let's take a look at what happens. So now when I move this up, you can see that the positions hopefully are kind of randomized. If we go into our random effector and go back to the parameter rather, we can kind of increase that so we can see it a little bit more. And so if I grab this and pull it up, but you can see as they settle down, that randomization goes away. So they eventually settle into a straight line. But you can see as they're moving down, they get some nice randomization. Okay, so let's go ahead in the next lesson and set up a quick camera and look at how we can set some keyframes to animate this group that we've created. And then we'll continue on by adding some of these little aliens flowing along these moving up and down. So to create a camera, we're going to come over here to cameras, and there are different types of cameras. Let's just choose a simple camera. Okay, so what we want to do now is go to cameras, use camera, and we'll choose our new camera. It's going to be located at the same spot where we had our perspective, but now we can sort of move this around and get it into position. Now one thing that we might want to do is to go ahead and move this up so we can see our objects in what will be their resting position. That way we can come in with our camera and create more of an interesting framing. Okay, so maybe something like that. Now I want the camera to remain where it is, and so in the camera object we're going to go to coordinates, and I'm going to set a keyframe to hold this camera exactly where it is so that if I ever move it around, I can just pop it right back to it. So in order to add a keyframe, there are different things that we can do. We can hit this record active objects, or I can control click on these little dots on the channels that we want to keyframe. So I want to keyframe the position, so control click, 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 and the same thing on the rotation. So now if I move the camera around, I can just scrub, and you can see pops right back into position. Okay, so we've got our camera set up. Now we'd like to maybe animate our effectors. So if I don't want to use the camera for now, let's jump back and use the default camera. So we're back sort of in this position. And let's change our range from 0 to 90. Let's change this maybe to 180, and we'll move the slider up. So that gives us a few more seconds. So basically 3 more seconds. So we've got 6 seconds total at 30 frames per second. So let's set a key on the position of this null, and we want to set it on basically on the Y position. So we'll set it here, and so I will go into the null, set a keyframe on the Y position, and this is moving both the random and the plane effectors together. So you could keyframe both of those separately. Let's go to 180, frame 180, and let's move it up until they're all in position. So something like that. Now you can see that this dot is orange, so there's no keyframe right on that frame. So let's control click to add a key. And now you can see if I scrub from 0 to 180, You can see that moving up and down. We can go in and now play the animation. And you can see how fast that is. Now, going into our camera, you can see we don't actually see all of that. And so, you could kind of slow that down if you wanted to and say, you know what, at 180, I actually don't want this to go all the way up. And you can do this kind of numerically here. Or you could come in to your other camera. So if we go into our default camera, we can say at 180, I don't really need it to be that far up. We can have it come maybe right about here. That way it'll move a little bit slower. So come in here to camera. Again, play that through. Now we can also come in here and say, you know what, as it comes down, maybe it's not quite as randomized as I'd like. And so we can come down here and say, at this point, we can have this under the effector, we want to do parameter, we can keyframe this at 300, but then maybe right here on this initial one, it's a little bit more. Move the keyframe just by clicking and dragging it. So maybe that's a little bit more what we want. So you can see the little ticks here indicating that we do have keyframes. I can click and drag across that, and I can move those around in the timeline to move those keyframes. So we've got a camera with a key set on it to hold the position, and then we've got keys set on our null, which contains our random and plane effectors, and we just created a simple animation of these kind of falling in from the sky. And if it's too fast, you can always kind of smooth this out. We could increase our rate here, our range rather, and then we could come in and take that null, grab that keyframe, move it up here, and then they'd come in even slower. So here you can see them coming in a little bit slower. Okay, so let's do something similar in the next lesson as we take our invader objects and we animate them traveling along a spline instead of coming down into a grid shape. So this will we'll use a spline path, we'll use a spline effector to be able to do that, change the offset, which change some. Thing we'll do is drop in a cloner, and let's add these to the cloner just as before. So we've now got all of these inside of our cloner. The next thing we'll do is come to the top view. Let's kind of zoom out a little bit. I'm just going to draw out a simple path from the top view that I want these to flow along. We can come in here and use one of these spline creation tools here. So you can click to create points with some of these. If you just choose a freehand, though, we can just sort of draw it out. So we come over here, back here, and then straight off this way. You can see it creates the points there. We can go to a rectangle selection. We can go to the use point tool and select the points and begin to move those. You can see that this particular spline is a Bezier because we have the Bezier handles. If we select the spline, you can see the type here. If you'd like to change the type, you can click on this and you can choose different types. Linear would be just straight lines between the points. Cubic, you can see the points are still on the lines, but we don't have the handles. Okay, if you wanted to do B-spline, kind of like a NURBS, then you'd have your points sort of off of the surface. So depending on how you want to start to manipulate this, you can change that to a different type. I'm just going to choose the cubic, and I'm just going to kind of smooth it out a little bit. So maybe something like that. All right. And kind of move our camera around. So now we'd like to clone the objects not based on a line or even a grid, but we'd like to clone them along a spline. So to do that, we can add a special effector. So we're going to go over to effectors. We've got our cloner selected. Let's go to MoGraph, effector, and let's choose a spline effector. So now you can see that that effector has been added. We need to go into the spline effector, and we need to add our spline. Let's actually name this so it's very clear. We'll just call this path. So we need to input into the spline effector the actual spline that we want to use, and that's going to be located right in here. Now, whenever we're doing this, all we have to do is just click and drag this down into that path. And you can see already we've got now some clones along this particular spline. Let's go into the cloner now, go back to object, and right now the count is set to 3. So if we take a look at this, there are only 3 clones. So what we want to do is increase the number of clones. So let's say we want them to be kind of spaced out like that. Now you can see right now that they're sort of upside down based on the way that we drew them. So one of the ways to change this is to go into the spline effector, and there's an up vector here. And in the Y, I'm just going to set that to 1, and that'll flip those over. Okay, so we've got the count, but we want them to now flow along the path or the spline. So what setting do we need to change to do this? Well, that's going to be in the spline effector, and that's going to be the offset. So you can see from 0, that's where they start, and if I just dial this offset up, they're just continue to flow along, which is what we want. Now, right now, they're flowing along in a very straight line. Okay, they're very close to one another. I want to add a little bit of randomness to this. So we'll go to effectors, and let's add another random effector. Now, in this random effector, we'll change some of these values. So we can change the positions. So I'm going to change the X position. Let's also change the Y position a little bit so that they're a little bit more off. They're not completely lined up. Okay, and I'm not going to change the Z too much because I don't want them to be kind of right on top of each other, but something like that will work. Okay, get our camera kind of down here. Maybe take the Y down a little bit. Okay, now we can animate this as well. So we come in here, and let's say that we want them to just start flowing past us. We'll choose the spline effector. We'll key the offset. So control, click on the offset at frame 0. And then I've got this set to 360 frames, but you can set that to whatever you like. We'll go to 360, and let's increase that offset. We'll just take it to 100 and see what that looks like. Control, click on the little dot, and that'll add 2 keyframes. Well, that'll add 1 keyframe, but we'll have 2 total. And so now when you dial through this, you can see that. Let's go into our random, and let's add a little bit of rotation. So I want to add a little bit of rotation. It's kind of like that, so that they're not completely straight. But you can see that the randomness of this stays the same throughout. And so another thing that we could do would be to maybe key this. So we could key the position and rotation, and then maybe do it the other way and key those. Maybe those flow out a little bit more, just to give us a little bit of movement there. So it's not completely steady. So they're moving a little bit. So there you can see we've taken 4 simple objects. We've added them to a cloner. So we've cloned them along a spline that we've created. So we drew out the spline path. And then all we have to do is use a spline effector, kind of put that into the cloner along with the random effector. And then inside of the spline effector, we use the spline. So you really start to build up some interesting things here with some very simple shapes that we've drawn out, put them inside of a cloner, and then just one other spline that we created. So this is a lot of, Cinema 4D is used a lot for broadcast and moving things around, broadcast elements and things like that. And so, these kinds of tools are going to be really helpful for you as you go through your work in Cinema 4D. So in the next lesson, let's take a look at something a bit different. So we'll actually go into some polygon modeling. So we've been using mainly splines and generators. It's actually assuming that he's sort of an octopus kind of a shape with one big eye. Let's translate this 2D image, basically, into a more realistic 3D object. Now, you don't have to do this. You could do it with anything, but I think this is going to be a fun little example. So let me kind of move this off to the side just so we can kind of see it. And so I want him to have this sort of bulbous head. So we can use primitive shapes just like we did with the splines when we're doing our 3D modeling. So we come up here to this cube, and you can see there are a number of different 3D shapes that we can create. Cube, a sphere, a capsule. I think a capsule in this case is going to be close to what we want. And so let's start with that. Go ahead and bring it into our scene. Now we can start to change some of these attributes. We can increase the radius and the height. So let's make this a bit bigger. If we go to our model tool here, this lets us deal with this as an object. That'll give us our handles, and then we can do this a little bit more quickly. So something like that. Let's bring it up a bit. And I want to see the actual lines here, the wireframe. So I'm going to go to Grow Shading Lines. And you can see our wireframe. So it's basically kind of a sphere on both ends, and then it's a cylinder in the middle, giving us our capsule shape. Now we can change things like the height segments. We can change the cap segments, and we can also change the rotation segments. Let's change those rotation segments down quite a bit. It's going to look pretty faceted, but we'll be able to smooth this later on to get the result that we want. Now I want these polygons. These are polygon faces right here. These are the points, edges, and polygons or faces. And you can access those by clicking on any of these when it's an editable polygon. Right now it's a primitive, so we're not able to access that. We'll get it as close as we can here and then make that editable. So I'm going to decrease the number of segments here so we get some polygons that are maybe a little bit more squared off. Maybe something like that. Okay, so these are my attributes, 3, 4, and 8, and kind of a rough measurement of the size there. So get it close to something like that, and then what we want to do is make that editable. So now that we've made it editable, we can access the points. We can move those around. We can access the edges, or we can access the polygons or the faces. When we go to live selection, we can get a preview of what we're clicking, and we can click on that. Now let's say I'd like to shape this a little bit. One of the ways that we can do this is simply to select the edges, and an edge loop is basically a contiguous loop going all the way around. So let's go to Select, Loop Selection, and we can come in, select a particular loop, go to, let's say, Scale, and we can begin to scale that. Okay, I'll do the same thing here. Kind of scale this down a little bit. Okay, and then just to kind of taper it down a little. We can also go to something like points with a rectangle selection. When we choose a rectangle selection, we want to always check this only select visible elements. We want to make sure that that's appropriate for what we're doing. I want to actually turn that off so I can select all the way through, and then I can kind of scale this down a little bit. Select these down here and scale those down a bit. All right, so something like that. We get a little bit more of a kind of a tapered shape to it. Now we want to create some tentacles coming off of this. So we'll use some of our polygon tools here. Let's select all of these faces going around the bottom of the base. And what extrude will do is pull those out, but we want to use a special kind of extrude because we want to do them all at once, and we want to have multiple sort of divisions at a time. So I'm going to right click and go to extrude, matrix extrude is what we want. And a lot of these, when you right click, depending on what you have selected, you'll be able to access the tools that you need. A lot of these tools also you can find under mesh, and then there are different tools in here that you can access. But it's easier sometimes to just hit the right click. We'll do a matrix extrude and then click and drag, and you can see that's pulling those out. Now right now they're sort of facing down. In our matrix extrude, we can kind of change this a little bit. We can change the movement. We can change the number of steps, so maybe reduce those steps a little bit. We can also change the rotation. So if I change this rotation, we can make it a little bit more kind of flat. You can get something like that. You can also maybe make it just a bit longer. And then also you can change the scale. So if you want it to be a little bit thicker, you can change that in here. And so that allows us to get these tentacles very, very quickly. And then we can drop out of that. We can also come in here and take these bottom faces and maybe move them up a little bit. Now you'll notice that there are a few different, or a couple of different kinds of polygon faces. There's a quad right here, and then we've got triangles right here. And depending on what you're doing, you may not want to have those triangles. In this case, it's really easy to get rid of those because we can come in here and select edges and just get rid of those. Now we don't want to delete those as I just did. I actually want to dissolve them. So right click, dissolve. That'll get rid of the edges without getting rid of the faces that are associated with them. We can do the same thing up here at the top if we want to. Kind of take these edges, leaving that cross pattern. We'll dissolve, and that'll leave quads up at the top. Now once we've got this basic shape, we may want to add a little bit more shape because it's kind of straight up and down. Let's take a look